You're listening to the Pure Fury Creations Entertainment Network. The views and opinions expressed on this episode are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or philosophies of the PFC Entertainment Network or any of the affiliates that make this show possible. This show has also been rated M for mature audiences only.
We don't talk about that.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to We Don't Talk About That. I'm Joanna, and with us we have
Natalie.
right? And today we're going to be talking about a topic that can be real sensitive to people. So we're calling it "Addicted to That Rush." Uh, we're really just talking about how trauma and addiction and things that can play out of that are all tied together. Is that what I'm understanding, Natalie?
Absolutely.
And we're not talking about just traditional addiction either. That's what we're not talking about. Just which is I should take the just out of there. We're not talking about chemical addiction, substance abuse, those kinds of things alone. There are other types of addiction that can go with trauma that people don't even realize they have.
Yes.
I certainly was one of them. So, but I've experienced both sides of this. So this will be an interesting podcast for us to talk about with, for me at least. We'll see how the listeners feel about it. But, with my past history, a lot of what I went through. My dad was a heroin addict. He's passed now. He was addicted to heroin for a long time, and on and off. It was a long period that it was on and off. And he cleaned himself up, a few times with the help of his sister and did really hard work, but it was always still like that monkey on his back, like they talk about, and it was still a concern later in life. And so there were a lot of things that came up because of it. And then there were also things that I know now. I've never had that type of addiction, but going through trauma recovery, I found other types of addiction that I have.
Right.
And I had other caregivers that had chemical dependence, but it wasn't to the level of my dad's heroin use. That was the biggest addiction, especially substance abuse that I had experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And I experienced that with him living in my home. So it was like a really, like when I was an adult and my kids were little, and it was a really traumatic thing in and of itself to go through.
Sure.
And to watch him go through that experience, and he went through all the things that we hear about addicts who hit rock bottom do, lose their home, end up living on the streets, injecting between their toes and things like that. Just terrible things, criminal elements. It was not a good situation.
No.
But it all, honestly, the more that I talked to him later, the more that I found out that he had something happen to him earlier in life. He didn't get into a lot of details, but something happened to him, and it left a mark.
Mm-hmm.
And that chemical, that substance, that use helped him forget about it.
Yeah, it masked everything.
Yeah. And his addictive peaks were directly related to like when my grandma died and when my grandpa died and things like that. So there were huge catalyst that happened in his life that made him turn to that level of substance.
Mm-hmm.
But once he got there, like he was there.
Yeah.
And it was very hard for him to break away from. And, it left, like he did a lot of things that affected my life. I was quite young when it first happened,
Sure.
as far as like in my adulthood. And then I was, in my, I think, early 20s. I think the time that it the most affected me. And then there was another time later, and then, he lived with me, and we did home hospice. And that was a big problem when they started prescribing pain medication.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah. Because he was in control of a lot of his care for a while. And and then we talked about this, that, he just couldn't control it. And I even talked to him at one point and said, if he would go back and change everything, would you go back and change it? And he said, no, probably not, because I enjoyed it too much. And that was my dad. Like, he was just, he was a self-labeled hedonist. So
True.
yeah, he was a little bit of a different animal, but he also had I think he had addictions to porn and to food. And I didn't figure out that those were connected probably to a lot of his feelings of self-worth,
Right.
and how that had been affected from whatever he'd gone through earlier in life. I didn't figure that out until much later, long after he'd gone. I just found the correct ton of porn after he died. That was fun.
Lord,
I knew he had some. Yeah, I didn't know he'd have that kind of library.
Right.
It was something.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the addictions that we've talked about: food, porn, attention, sex, gambling, shopping, social media. These are all those addictions that, gambling people kind of, rate in the higher one, but the other ones, a lot of people don't even put on their radar as being like a problem.
Right. And it's not necessarily
Or video games.
openly talked about, or, people will
For
talk
sure.
about addictions in family, back in the day, very hush hush, like we don't let anybody outside the family know this stuff.
Right.
But the rest of it was never really normalized or brought to light, so to speak, as being an addiction or an issue. It's just like, they eat a lot. Well, they shop a lot. That just kind of caused it to be something that wasn't a big deal, even though it was a big deal.
Right.
It's kind of crazy. In like the general super brief description of any kind of addiction is like anytime someone loses control over their actions in order to engage in a behavior for a brief feeling of pleasure, or for a brief feeling of excitement, or just to numb in general. Like, very, very brief description. And like in a lot of the signs that people think of, when they look at addiction in general, and obviously significant time engaging in whatever that addiction is. Inability to quit said addiction. Oh yeah, I can quit. I can quit anytime, but obviously they never quit. Or if they do try to quit, like there's huge withdrawal symptoms from quitting that behavior.
Right.
Ability to fulfill obligations, like your personal life is struggling, your social life is struggling, your employment is struggling. Like you're seeking ways to engage in that behavior rather than go to work, rather than attend to your spouse or your kids or your family in general or your friends or all the things you used to have interest in. Like you just stop doing it because you're looking to engage in that behavior, whatever that behavior is.
Right.
Increased tolerance. Like you don't just start with like one thing and then maintain just taking whatever that one thing is, or just doing that one behavior that one time, and that like satiates you over like 20, 30 years. Like your tolerance increases. So now I'm using more, or I'm spending more, or I'm eating more, in order to find that release or that relief that you're trying to look for. And typically, and like you mentioned, like there are two different groupings or two different headings of addiction, like the physical addictions, which are obviously your alcohol, your prescription drugs, and your illicit drugs. So any of the drugs deemed illegal. And then overuse of those things. And people talk about them all the time. They talk about alcohol addiction. They talk about any kind of drug addiction. AA's been around for a million years. Okay, maybe not a million, but it's been around for a really long time. NA's been around for a really long time. Al-Anon has been around. Narconon, like all of these things have been around for a really long time. So it's like, oh, my so-and-so has an addiction. Oh, drugs or alcohol.
The stigmatism is greatly reduced with those things.
Yeah, because it's like that's
greatly reduced.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, it's a disease. I get it. It's really hard, and
right.
And then there is that. There's also the school of thought of there's a lot of people who label it a disease. And then there's also a school of thought that it is behavioral. That a lot of addictions, yes, you become addicted physically to the substance or whatever, but there are also behavioral choices that are involved.
Right.
And so that's why the disease is curable, is because you have free will, and there are thought processes that go into it. And if you can change some of those behavioral things that are driving you, whether it's stimulations that are happening in your environment, or you're internally having things that are attacking you, like from PTSD,
sure.
Anything like that, if you can curb either how they're affecting you or how you're reacting to them, which I mean, that's always our goal, is to be responsive over reactive. But
right,
that seems to be how we take the steps to address these addictions. But it takes, the first step, I think, is being able to actually admit, like, okay, this is actually a problem for me.
Right, which is the hardest step.
It is. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, societal acceptance. And then there's also accessibility of treatment, just the cost of it. When you're talking about being able to go to see a professional, AA is free, NA is free. That's great. There are support groups for codependency. And then you can find support groups if you really search and look for other things, but it's not as easy. PTSD is a little easier, but when you're getting down to PTSD for what?
Right.
Because if I have PTSD for childhood sexual trauma, I'm not going to want to go to a group that's about war veterans.
Right.
We're not going to be able to connect in the same ways, and they're not going to want to hear my stories in the same way.
True.
So it's more difficult to get that, I think, to get care, especially when you're talking about things like food addiction, or even addiction to, there's even things like addiction to attention, which was something that I dealt with a lot, not realizing that was an issue. And it wasn't that I was actually harming myself and others, and I didn't realize it, but I wasn't doing it. It wasn't in an overt manner. It wasn't in a malicious manner.
Right.
But it was a constant, like, diverting the subject to myself, just being the loudest, the biggest, the brightest, the shiniest object in the room, like being useful to everybody, and then nobody else gets a chance to help in a situation because I've already run in and done it all. Kind of controlling the situation, and all of that had to do with a need for people to see me.
Sure.
a need for people to know who I was as a person and value me.
Mm-hmm.
And I became addicted to that feeling of like, if I volunteer in this situation or I do this thing or whatever, and this is something that's really hard for me to talk about because, again, it's embarrassing.
Right.
We don't talk about this
No.
in society.
No.
So I've had to work really hard so people think I've gotten cold and distant. And in
Yeah.
reality, it's just been me trying not to indulge in unhealthy behaviors
Yeah.
that were actually harmful to myself and others. They just
Right.
weren't overtly harmful. I wasn't going around shouting at people. I wasn't going around being malicious. But I was being a perfectionist. And like I said, just drawing the attention to myself in times where it wasn't necessary,
Mm-hmm.
just to feel like I was part of the group, a
Right.
part of the event. So then dealing with watching people in my family deal with food addiction, people
Mm-hmm.
that I love deeply, and then porn addiction. And these are not being things that we can talk about.
Right.
Even with friends.
Because a lot of people they don't understand it. They're like,
No,
well, you can just stop eating. Like, you can just stop this. And like you said earlier, a lot of people put it into two different categories. Like, it's a disease or it's just a behavioral thing. So a lot of professionals and non-professionals, kind of look at like, okay, well, the alcohol, the drugs, that's the disease, but all of these others that fall under the behavioral umbrella of addiction, those are just all behavioral. When in
right?
reality, like, they're still impacting our lives in exactly the same way. Only one is destroying our brain, where the other one's destroying our body and our sense of self.
Correct.
So and I get it, why my people in the therapeutic world, the behavioral health world, are often split. Like, well, is it really this? Is it really this? Even though the DSM categorizes all of it under the umbrella of addiction, but the medical world sees the drugs and the alcohol under, well, that's actually disease because of how it's destroying the brain, which makes it really hard for people to truly understand how someone can be addicted to different behavioral things. Like you mentioned, the food, which can be overeating or undereating. Like a lot of, the eating disorders
Bulimia.
fall under like the food addiction, but food addiction doesn't necessarily mean that you're eating all the time. It can mean that you're not eating all the time because you're looking for some kind of control.
Depriving yourself.
Yeah, in order to feel less chaotic. So this is the one thing I can control. Nobody else can control how much I intake or how little I intake. Mentioned gambling. Now there's commercials everywhere about gamblers. I really appreciate that they will do like a slot machine or like a casino commercial and then immediately follow it up with like, but if you're struggling with gambling, how about you just don't even show those commercials? Like, we don't have cigarette commercials anymore. Can we just do away with like something that's going to trigger somebody else to do something?
Right.
And then you mentioned shopping, which also shopping comes with spending. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're like running out to every store all the time to shop, or that you're trying to spend the money as quickly as it, lands in your pocket. It's that internal, like, I'm extremely stressed. I don't know what to do with my feelings and emotions. I don't like how this is feeling, but you know what'll make me feel better? This $900 bottled perfume, or this $30 bottle of this, or just going out and buying all the snacks that I could never have, even though I'm not going to eat them. I just want the snacks or the clothes. So those fall into it. You mentioned gaming, which what, I don't even know when Atari came out. Atari came out like a million years ago.
Man, I think I was about like 9 years old because I remember I
Well,
wanted one and I finally got one.
like the
So
80s.
somewhere around there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like the first Nintendo came out, and now like you can pick up any of your phones and play any games that you want, go on your computer, any game that you want, but then getting sucked into that gaming world. Whether it is a world you're building with other people, it's something that is just a solo game, but getting sucked into that because the rewards that you get whenever you conquer a monster, you shoot a person, you beat someone in a race, you finally make it through all the levels of Super Mario Brothers. Like that satisfaction that comes in, the like, okay, this earned me a reward, so I need to keep doing this. This makes me feel good, so I'm going to keep doing it.
Right. And it's to the detriment of things in your life, correct? If we're not talking about like you should never do these things and cleaning is bad or whatever, that I mean, there are some of this that we're saying like we should be really careful, like gambling.
Right. And it's when it becomes a hindrance, when you are choosing to do said thing rather than engage with your partner, engage with your kids, engage with your friends, leave your house, shower, eat, go to work. Like you're ignoring and separating yourself from everybody and everything else in order to do said behavior. Now that's a problem. Like when you're choosing, your spouse is like, hey, let's have a little bit of sexy time. And you're like, okay, I'll be right there. 7 hours later, you're still gaming. Like that's a problem. That's a huge problem. The internet, we all love it because we don't have to go through the card catalog at the library anymore in order to find that one thing to do our research.
Right.
Like we have full use of everything right on our phone. So you can be addicted to the internet, which includes like your phone, your computer, your tablet, to where you're literally, you can be researching, I don't know, the origin of stars and be sucked into that for days or weeks or months in an effort to avoid everything that's going on around you, kind of numb your feelings, but getting some satisfaction like, oh, I never knew that before. So if I know that now, that's connected to this. So it's a different, deeper level of commitment, I should say, instead of like, oh, I'm passionate about stars, I want to research stars for a purpose. You're not researching the stars for a purpose other than to hide from whatever has gone on in your life, whether it's from the past, whether it's in the present. You're looking for that escape. Work is a huge addiction. There's a lot of people that are addicted to work, because if I go to work I can control. Work, I understand the rules. Work makes sense to me, so therefore I'm going to work all that I can. I'm going to spend less time with friends, with partners, with kids, with activities, because none of that makes sense. So I'm going to ignore all of that, and I'm just going to focus on work until it's to my detriment. Exercising, working out, you can do too much. You can really do too much. Plastic surgery.
Oh, yeah.
Take a look at some of the actors and actresses. Like, some have become so addicted to it that they no longer resemble the person that they were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Like, I get it. Like, a little tweak, a little tuck, a little whatever. I don't really know much about plastic surgery. But if you look at some and you're like, who is that? And they're like, put the name on the bottom of the screen. You're like, there's no way that that's that same person. Like, it's impossible that that's that same person. So that can become a thing. Pain-seeking behavior, cutting behaviors. And cutting is kind of in two separate categories. Like cutting initially because like you're numbing, you feel so numb that you need to find something to where you're feeling pain. And cutting is not suicidal. Cutting does not mean you want to commit suicide or end your life. Like cutting is a way for you to remind yourself that you do still exist, that you are still here, but it can be taken too far. Where now I'm looking for any reason to cut. I'm looking for any reason to engage in any pain-seeking behavior.
And yeah, and that's, I was going to say, it's not just cutting, because when I was a kid, I didn't cut. I
Right.
would, first of all, it wasn't really a thing back then, but
Mhm.
I would have been seen and I would have been caught, and then there would have been consequences and they wouldn't have been good. So
Mhm.
I tore at the skin. You know how you get calluses and they'll get like rough? And I would just pick and pick and pick at the skin of my feet until they would bleed. And
Right.
it would hurt. And it was so that every time I walked, I could feel the pain. You could feel it then through your feet.
Yeah.
And it gave me, and I didn't understand then what I was doing. I just used to think like, man, there's just something wrong with me that I need this.
Right.
But when I look back at everything that I was going through, it all makes sense why I was doing that. I had bulimia. I was bulimic. Um, I had a lot of different behaviors that were attached to all of the trauma I'd gone through, all of the PTSD that I was still dealing with, that I carried with me for a really long time.
Sure.
Not knowing that's what it was. I don't even think back then they labeled you with PTSD if you had trauma, you
No.
know? So it wasn't until much later. And I came to the realization on my own because I was just sitting there one day. I'd seen something about what soldiers were going through and what their events were like. And then I was like a couple weeks later, and I had one of my episodes, and I was like, I have PTSD.
Mhm.
It's the same thing. I'm being attacked. It's the same thing. I am back in the memories and all the things. And so
Right.
it made sense later once I understood and I went through the healing process and I could look back, hindsight is 2020.
Mhm.
So then I could look back and be like, oh, that's why I was doing this. That's why I was doing that. That's why I needed this. That's why, and that's why I was able to stop this without actually going to treatment for it. Or like I never went to any kind of treatment for my eating disorder. I never went to any kind of treatment for my pain seeking behaviors, but they have resolved. I
Right.
don't have any of those behavior. I will. The only time I will say with the bulimia, that's something that I think sticks with you when you're overweight
Mhm.
and your stomach is full and you overeat and you just think, oh, and those things, and you have to remind yourself that's an unhealthy behavior. You cannot engage in that.
Yeah.
So it's a lifelong thing, and that's one of those, like,
Sure.
it's a lifelong fighting the urge, just like fighting the urge to smoke or drink or whatever maybe your addiction. I
Mhm.
mean, I know people that quit smoking and 20 years later are still like, man, I would give anything for a cigarette, but I'm not going to have one because I don't want to smoke,
Right. Right.
you know? So, I think the biggest part for me was being able to find ways to forgive the people and myself
Mhm.
for having these behaviors and not holding them accountable for what they were doing, but not like blaming them for everything in an unrealistic or blown out of proportion way,
Right.
it, including myself. I had to put it in perspective and think about what had happened, and then also what were they or I are choosing now. I mean, my dad did
Sure.
choose to get himself clean and stop every time that the behavior was found out, and the choice was between, okay, you that's what I would tell him. You can do the heroin. I can't stop you. You can't be in my life.
Right.
And that was literally the boundary that I would set with him. And I wouldn't get real. It didn't help to get loud with him
No.
in that situation. I would just be like, look, you can pick one or the other, but it can't be both.
Yeah.
And he would grudgingly let go of the heroin because he wanted me. And I had to accept that even though it was grudgingly, that was because he loved the high, but he loved me more.
Right.
Right. And that was what mattered. And at the end of his life, it wasn't until the last like 3 days that he was passing that he finally got some morphine, and he got to enjoy those last 3 days. But it was in a totally different circumstance. It
Sure.
didn't trigger all those feelings of like, like it had every time he'd been prescribed the Percocet and then overtaken it or whatever. So, and the same thing with watching any other caregiver. Functional alcoholism is something that a lot of people deal with.
Mm-hmm.
growing up, especially back in the 80s. I think it was pretty normal that you came home, you had to drink, you
Right.
know?
7.
Yeah. And that was it. And I knew that there were going to be, I knew that as I got older, that there were people in my life that needed that alcohol
Mm-hmm.
in order for them to be able to be even courteous, much less functional. And it was just that the minimal amounts, and as long as so then I kept them at kind of arm's length, but didn't necessarily cut them out of my life for a long time.
Right. Right.
And you find out the balance of where, and you kind of just let them know, like, if you, because you can't ever control these people's behaviors. Other people's behaviors are not something you can control.
No, never.
You can only set the boundary of what you'll accept,
Right.
and then distance yourself if they are not able to meet that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of what I did. In one case, I had, my dad, who was very much like, okay, well, this sucks, but I'll do it. And then with other people in my life, it was more like, this is how I have to accept that this is how that you are going to live your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be part of my life. We'll just keep our distance.
Right.
And it's sad, but you
Yes.
can't save everybody.
No. And it's not your job to save anybody.
It's not. It's not. It's your job to maintain and protect your own boundaries and take care of yourself and your children.
Mm-hmm.
And, but being able to separate myself from other people's problems and needs, and then allowed me to then focus on my own and
Yeah.
notice some of these behavioral problems that I had of my own that I had not acknowledged or faced.
Mm-hmm.
And then being able to address like how I was using food as punishment, for instance.
Right.
A reward or punishment. And that's something that I still work with, but at least I'm aware of it now, and I can address the behavior when I feel it coming up.
Mm-hmm.
I may not be able to stop it, but you may not be able to stop it every time from happening. Like sometimes, I don't know if there's other people that experience this, but I've even had like late night eating where you just get and you're so out of it, you're so tired that you just go down there and you don't even realize that you're down there eating.
Sure.
And then you wake up and you realize like, oh, I don't even want to be here. And it's that kind of stuff that I think that you have to work on when you're struggling with like food addiction. There are people in my life that have struggled with porn addiction, and my dad being one of them. He and I didn't talk a lot about it, but I wish that he was alive so I could talk to him about it, because I know other people that have struggled. It's actually a bigger problem than people realize today. I think COVID played a part, don't you?
I don't think so.
No? The isolation?
It didn't help.
For sure.
Sure. It definitely didn't help. But it's been around obviously long before COVID happened.
It has.
But and I think the internet, like the access to things readily available, like that's when it became more extreme, a lot easier to indulge, and a lot easier to hide. Like you can't hide a bunch of VHS tapes. You can't hide a bunch of Playboys or Playgirls or Penthouses for too long. But eventually, like someone's going to come across those where you can hide everything on your phone. You can hide things on your tablet. You can hide things in your computer. So I think that really pushed it over the edge for sure.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think that, and we had the internet, we've had it for like, 30 years, something like that. It hasn't been super long, but 20, 30 years. Like, I would say mainstream internet is what I'm talking about, not the internet itself, but mainstream internet where it was readily accessible in our hands. We could get a hold of it. That started kind of in the 80s. We started having cell phones, and we started having computer access. And then from there, it got even more extreme. And I think you're right, it's become more of a handheld thing.
Right.
It's just like it's there anytime you want it.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, you can hide it, but also you can pretend like it's not a problem because you can't visually see what you've got. Like you can't, you might look at your collection and it's just a bunch of files.
Right.
It doesn't look like a stack of 300 tapes.
Right.
Or 300 magazines. So I think it's easier for the addiction to grow.
Oh, for sure.
Because it's not as tangible.
Mm-hmm.
It's just ether on the internet. Like it's no big deal. Yeah. That's what people think. And there's so much, porn is one thing that there's a lot of different schools of thought about it. But my therapist and I talked about just how it desensitizes the brain, really, to real life experiences. That's the biggest problem with it.
100%.
It gives false expectations to those who haven't been out in society and experienced a lot of sexual contact, and then it desensitizes what you are able to get aroused by because it's so extreme what you have access to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, and that's something that becomes a huge problem in relationships.
Oh, 100%.
Wonderful, perfect, loving relationships that can all of a sudden, the sex slows down, the sex stops. Nobody understands why. There's distance. There's one partner starts to get more sharp with the other one or more, and you just don't understand what's going on. Why? It almost feels like the partner's cheating.
Right.
When in reality, and I guess in some ways, maybe you could label it that way, depending if they are emotionally and physically engaging with another person and giving them their sexual energy, then and depriving you of it as a partner, it can feel very much like cheating.
Sure.
So it's one of those things that porn addiction is damaging, just like every other addiction, to everyone around you that is in your intimate circle.
Yes.
Especially your partner.
Yes.
Food addiction is one of those that people, I feel like that's one that people have some of the least grace for. Because the bigger you get, the less kind people are to you in society.
It's much easier to see.
Yes.
You can't see porn addiction, or you can't see someone's gambling addiction, but you can see someone's food addiction.
You can see their weakness.
Right.
You can see how they were not able to control themselves.
Right.
I did air quotes there, guys, because, like, as we talked about, it's not, there are things that drive you to these behaviors, and you have to do the work to get down. And we'll get to that very shortly, but you have to do the work to get down to figure out, like, what is it that's driving me to engage in these behaviors before they're ever going to stop.
Absolutely.
Like
we said in the beginning, is you as the individual person saying, this has become a problem. I need to figure out how to stop this problem, or how to fix this problem, or address this problem. 17 million people in your life can absolutely tell you that it's a problem, but until you believe that it's a problem for you, nothing's going to change.
Well, how do you if you don't recognize that it's a problem for you, then you're not going to recognize what's triggering you to do it. And if you can't recognize what's triggering you to do it, how do you ever even address trying to stop it?
Exactly. It's like the chicken or the egg, like which.
Right. Well, but in this case, like you got to break an egg to make an omelet. You have to address something, figure out whether it's just saying, look, this is a problem for me. I don't know what it is that is driving this, but I need help. Or A, B, and C happened, or A happened, or whatever, blah, blah, happened. I was in a terrible event and this happened. Now I can't get it out of my head. And it's driving me to do this and I need help. Whatever it is. And then you got to follow through and actually do that work. DBT is one of those things that I know that they talk about using for addiction.
Mm-hmm.
But talk to us about some of the ways that we would address addiction.
Obviously, the groups are super helpful in a lot of ways. And then pretty much any type of therapy that you would want to have can help you address so many different things. A lot of times CBT, there's specific therapists that specialize in addiction treatment. So it's like, okay, that would be someone that you want to engage in first. Like, do you specialize in addictions? And if they're like, yes, absolutely, great. What kind of addictions? Because there's people that are 100% schooled in all the drug and alcohol addictions, but don't really have a firm grasp or a true understanding or even believe that you can have like a shopping addiction or you can have a gaming addiction. So not that it's not triggering the same receptors in the brain for that pleasure seeking, but it's easier to gain access to a behavioral addiction than it is to gain access to a physical addiction. Like for physical addiction, you have to go out of your house in order to find said person, place to purchase your alcohol, to purchase your drugs, to get your prescriptions. Like you have to go to somebody else for those things. Where with your behavioral addictions, you don't have to really go anywhere to ask anybody for any of the things. So working with an addiction specialist is going to help kind of break down those secret keeping behaviors, the sneaky behaviors, the minimization of the behaviors, and really help you get to the root of why you are doing what it is that you're doing. Because now we know the why, now we can figure out the how. In order to, okay, what else do we need? Do we need to go through some trauma therapy in order to address the trauma? Do we need to go through some cognitive behavioral therapy? Do we need you to have better access to your emotions? Do we need you to be more mindful? Do we need you to be more present? Like pretty much any kind of therapy is going to be helpful in some way. And depending on where you go, you might be like, okay, well, I've reached the end of this piece. Now what? And of course, your therapist should be able to help you say, okay, you've reached the end of your trauma stuff. Like your trauma has been addressed. You're here, here, and here. You've done this, this, and this. My recommendation is that you now go and do A, B, or C for your next step. And then you go and do A, B, or C. And then working your way through. Not that you're not ever going to have those cravings, like you mentioned, people with cigarettes quit smoking 30, 40 years, and sometimes they're like, man, I just want to, sometimes I walk behind people when they smoke just to smell it. Mm-hmm. Like part of that is always going to be inside of you, which might be why like they refer to it as a disease. Like it's always going to be a part of you. And it doesn't mean that even if you've worked through every trauma, you've healed everything, that you're not still going to have triggers, that you're not still going to have urges. Just like anything else we've talked about in previous episodes, like your triggers are still going to happen. How you manage those triggers going forward is going to be very different than how you managed them in the past.
Right. And triggers are always our own responsibility. It's not that somebody is, you can say they're triggering me. It's still your responsibility to manage that you have that trigger and you got to do something with it.
I'm getting triggered by this behavior. Yeah. Instead of you're triggering me, I'm getting triggered by your behavior. I need to know why. I need to figure out the why and what I'm going to do with that. Which is super hard to do because then again, boundaries. Like boundaries are really difficult.
Well, and it's also shadow work, which will be something that we'll talk about in season 2. But it's, shadow work was one of the most difficult parts of therapy for me to accept that, like, oh, this is a thing that I have to do. Right. And then actually doing it.
Yeah.
and finding ways to stop and go, what is my role in this? Every time there was an altercation, an incident, even if it was that somebody else had done something, like, wait a minute, I'm not saying that I'm at fault. I'm just asking, did I somehow, how somehow did I came into this event and somehow something happened that the two things hit and sparked.
Right.
What was my portion of that? Was it perfectly innocent and I did absolutely nothing and it was the other person that had their own trigger? Or was there something hidden there, like my attention-seeking behavior or my, food deprivation or whatever, like that kind of stuff? Fear that comes from me having also sphincter hoded dysfunction. So I'm afraid a lot of food. Sometimes when I start getting sick, I'm like, I don't know if I want to eat. That's gotten a lot better, thankfully, over the years. But I used to be quite, I would go to places and just not eat for hours,
Mm-hmm.
and then people get very concerned about your health and they also get offended because everything's around food. So, there's a lot of different things that come forward with these behavioral type addictions that you have to be able to do that deep work, that shadow work, and go, wait a minute, what is my part in what is the behavior? How is this affecting me? And why am I reacting? Why am I responsive to it?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start getting answers and you can actually start having some power and doing something about it.
Right.
Versus being at the mercy of it everywhere that you go.
And a lot of times you end up in therapy. Maybe it's not even about your addiction, especially if it's a behavioral addiction. Like maybe it's not even about that. And then you learn throughout the course of the therapy, like, oh, I do that.
Right. That's me. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that adds another layer of like shame and guilt.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't necessarily stop you from the behavior yet, because is it really a problem? It's really only impacting me. It's not really impacting other people.
Well,
but it is impacting other people.
I'm aware that it impacts other people. I'm not aware that it's happening sometimes until it's already happening.
Right.
Like it's not like you get a warning, you get an itch and you feel it coming.
Mm-hmm.
It just all of a sudden it's happening. And then I have to stop myself and go, oh, either I'll just stop talking or actually, backtrack or apologize. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to change. I didn't mean to make that about myself or whatever.
Right.
But I don't know. It like you said, I didn't go to therapy thinking that I had any addictive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I had addictive parents.
Right.
Parents who had addictive personalities, especially my father. And I knew that was a concern for me just because I had, nature versus nurture, having grown up in their aura, in their environment, and then also hereditary, is there a connection? Mm-hmm. So that's been something that I have personally struggled with on either side. I never actually got involved with any kind of substances, really, not because of any special thing, just because I knew my dad had been addicted to heroin. He had used a lot of cocaine. He bragged about it. These were stories he would tell me when I was young about how much drugs he would use and stuff. This isn't like a hush hush family secret I'm telling. Right. And I remember thinking, I don't want that. So I just was afraid I would like it. I was terrified that I would like it, and so I never tried it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it was a decision that I made. Come to find out later, through my health issues and my GI issues specifically, and all the surgeries that I had to have, I don't respond well to medications anyway, so I can't take like the Norcos and hydrocodones and all that. They make me really sick. So, and that worked out in my benefit. Same thing with alcohol. Like I can only drink a little bit so much. I can drink for maybe a day, and then or two, and then that's it. I gotta stop for a while. because I feel terrible afterwards.
Sure.
It's not as enjoyable for me as it is for other people.
Sure.
So it's helped me be able, but I'm aware that if I didn't have that physical barrier, I probably would be dealing with a much more addictive issue on my hands.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I do have a tendency to delve into things that make me feel valued, loved, supported, seen.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that I do it in a more aggressive or in-depth way than people who had a stable, like, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, but they had those dependable parents that gave them the sure footing that they needed to be able to go out into life.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have, you know, my husband is like that. Like, he doesn't have that kind of behavior. He's one of the most generous, kind guys that you'd ever want to meet. Yin and yang, right? Opposites attract. But it was these things. It's, first of all, it's hard to talk about, because when you talk about it, then people notice it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start to get that label on you anyway.
Right.
And it's also hard to talk about because it's not something that is as forgiven in society as if I had a drug addiction, or if I had an alcohol addiction, or something like that. So
Absolutely.
these issues have been something that were hard for me to address internally, and then be able to say, like, okay, and I'm going to talk about it on the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
and I know you've mentioned like porn addiction before, and that falls under obviously the umbrella of sex addiction. And there's been people that'll be like, oh, I'm a sex addict. I'm a sex addict. And they use it as a joke just because they want to have sex with a lot of people, or they want to have sex.
I'm a nympho.
Right. Like, when, again, it's impacting your life, like your whole focus is on, when am I going to get the sex? How am I going to get the sex? Like, your whole life is focused on that, to the detriment of your family, to the detriment of your job, those sorts of things. And then another one that goes really unnoticed by a lot of people is compulsive masturbation. Like, that is huge. That is huge.
And you talked about these, that like sex addiction and compulsive masturbation, part of the reason that they're at the addiction point is they're not having a good time at this point. It is a need, a compulsion.
I have to do this.
Have to do it.
Do this because
every minute I can get away.
I get from it. And the pleasure that I get from it makes me feel okay about where I'm at. And a lot of times with some of the behavioral ones, like, you're not, I mean, you're aware of what you're doing, but you're also not aware of what you're doing until after the fact. Right. You mentioned. Right. With one client, what feels like a million years ago. And we were working on a masturbation addiction. Once that came to light, which didn't come to light until 6-7 months into treatment.
Yes, because it's so shameful to talk about.
And it was more because, like, his spouse wanted, like, to be intimate. And I said, well, like, what got you upset about that? He's like, we literally have sex all the time. Like, I don't understand. And I'm like, well, if you have sex all the time, why is your wife saying that you guys have not had sex? Like, where's the disconnect? So obviously, breaking it down, he was engaging in masturbation all of the time, which led his brain to believe, like, I'm fine. Like, the sex is happening. I'm fine. And he couldn't see the disconnect that he was having from not engaging in sexual behavior with his wife. So because it just becomes like, I have to do this. I have to cut in order to feel the pain. I have to eat in order to numb the pain. I have to gamble. And like, it all becomes part of the same thing. And a lot of this, not to say every single addiction you have in life, is because of trauma, because it's not.
No.
And a lot of not all of them, but like many of the sex addiction behaviors, the masturbation, the porn, the actual sex itself, like that's an unhealed, could be from a like unhealed emotional and or sexual trauma that you experienced as a child. Like that's where that's coming from.
It could be. I read a book because I wanted to be informed on this when I found out about this porn addiction thing. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I thought this was important. And I read a book about how you can also develop a porn addiction by, let's say, you have a childhood where your parents are not, they're loving, they're caring in some ways, but they're not meeting your emotional needs. They're not reassuring you. They're not making you feel safe. They're not making you feel comforted.
Right.
They're not making you feel necessarily loved in the way that you need. And then you come across pornography, and you get triggered in some way, hurt in some way, something happens, some event. And then at the same time, in the same realm, at the same, and we're talking young, 7, 8 years old, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, somewhere around there. You also come across pornography, which stimulates those brain areas of pleasure.
Right.
And as a child, you are not able to differentiate. And so you go, well, this makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And you start seeking that out.
Right.
And it can lead to an actual, like almost hidden lifelong porn addiction.
Right.
That a lot of men and women can experience. My dad had a ton of porn. I came across porn at a young age. And the only reason that I didn't get addicted to it, I think, is because of my own sexual trauma. It drove me away from it.
Mm-hmm.
I was scared of a lot of it, but and it was a lot of deep shame that was embedded with it.
Sure.
It brought up deep, deep shame. But I know other people who have had sexual trauma who went the other way. But I think that that's also something to be, it's not necessarily about sexual trauma. Sometimes they can just be like, your needs weren't being met. You come across porn that meets your needs. And now all of a sudden it's your best friend.
Right. Which is what I said. Like that's where it comes.
Right.
Is a deep lack of unhealed emotional and or sexual trauma. Like it's coming from an emotional place or a sexual place, sometimes both. But that is what kind of impacts it. And again, getting to the root underneath all of it, addressing that root cause of things is what's going to help a client better manage coping skills, better manage their reactions, their responses, better manage their triggers in order to decrease the negative behaviors and find ways to increase positive behaviors that are still going to give them pleasure, but also not allow them to disengage from the unpleasant. Like the only way that we know that something is unpleasant is because we know something that has pleasure. And we can't have one without the other. Either everything's all unpleasant all the time and there is no pleasure, or we have pleasure all the time and there is no, there has to be the balance between the two. And you have to be able to allow yourself to feel all the uncomfortable, shitty, terrible feelings in order to get through them to then build on all the good, warm and fuzzy, happy feelings.
Yeah. And that's the hardest part is getting through feel your feelings. That's what Michelle Chalfant will say. Feel your feelings. But it's hard to sit in them.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
And that's what makes you chase the thing that makes the feeling go away.
Yeah.
Which is how we end up with addictions.
Yes. Yeah.
Behavioral or what did you say they were? Label them for me again.
Physical and behavioral.
Physical and behavioral, because I always want to say chemical and behavioral. They're not. It's physical and behavioral.
I mean, the physical ones do kind of rewire the chemicals in your brain, which can cause other issues to kind of form. You can use so much of, let's say, spice, for example, back when that was a thing, or bath salts, or anything laced with anything that can then now plummet you into some kind of schizophrenic episode that is brought on by the damage in your brain.
Well, we actually went to high school with somebody that it happened to, and I'm not going to label names, but I knew somebody who they had an underlying mental health condition we didn't know about, and they were given LSD by an adult
Mm-hmm.
And it was bad and it was too much. And it ended up triggering a terrible mental health episode on this person.
Right.
And they ended up being hospitalized for a really long time. It redirected the whole trajectory of their life, I
Oh,
believe.
absolutely. Absolutely.
I truly believe it did. And it was something that was, I wish that I could get more in depth into the story because the person who was responsible didn't really pay any price for it. It was the person, so it's something that we really have to be careful about. Like if you're going to get into these substances and stuff, do it just for you. Don't get it, don't get anybody else involved. If somebody else is involved, then they have to do their own stuff, like get their own stuff. This is the whole topic of addiction is just so difficult for people to even broach.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is.
Because of how it affects mental health too.
Absolutely.
So,
And you don't have to have trauma to become an addict. And just because you're an addict doesn't mean that you don't not have trauma. Like
right.
Some can go hand in hand and some have nothing to do with the other.
For sure.
It's just a matter of, okay, do I have some of these things? Are some of these things impacting my life in a way that I no longer like or that's no longer serving its purpose? Let me find someone and let me talk to someone in order to figure that out so that I can stop doing it.
I mean, that's what leads us all to the best version of ourselves.
Absolutely.
Leading our best lives.
Mm-hmm.
As hard as it is to go through the like, oh, I'm doing these things and then address it. As you start to recognize, and even if you're not on the other side of it, just knowing that you're showing up for yourself and actively working to not hurt yourself and other people anymore can be so empowering and freeing and can help you with your treatment along the way. Definitely. So don't give up just because it's hard. I won't say that any of it is not hard. It is absolutely hard.
Yes.
But
you're worth it.
Like, don't quit quitting. Just keep going.
Yeah.
So yeah, we are all worth it, and those of us who need it, I'm worth it. Those of us who are struggling out there, those of you who are struggling with any type of addiction that maybe you realized even as we're talking on this, oh, that's something that I actually indulge in. Like, don't let it take your moment to feel whatever feelings you have, but don't let that stop you from taking your steps to be able to address it so that you can become the best version of yourself.
Absolutely.
Because it's holding you back.
Absolutely.
Whatever it is that's limiting you, you are tied to that thing. So, yeah. I don't know. What else you got for me, girl?
That's all I got today.
Well, you know what? The other thing we haven't talked about, having had some health conditions that, like, my stuff is documented. I can't make my stuff up, but I have been because I have the mental health conditions, I've been in situations where I have met people who do make up medical conditions for attention. So they get addicted to having medical procedures, get addicted to having just that, and it's the care, I think, that is the attention, the care.
Sure.
Is that what we're talking about, hypochondria, or we're talking about Munchausen's? They're separate. Those are two separate things.
Two separate things.
And are they at all connected to addiction?
Yes, adjacent. Like hypochondria is more like you cut your finger, so now all of a sudden you have a blood disease and you're going to die from that. Like everything is taken to the next extreme. So that's really based in anxiety. Okay. It's not that you're seeking attention from other people in the same way that like Munchausen's and Munchausen's by proxy kind of does. It's just that everything goes to the extreme for one reason or another. And then Munchausen's is obviously you're creating your medical issues to seek treatment so that you can then be, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. Like, what can I do to help you? What do you need? So you're getting your needs met by other people in a way that's not healthy for your body, for sure. But definitely not healthy because now you're engaging in relationships with people that are built completely on a lie and everything that's false.
Right.
Then the Munchausen's by proxy is like a caregiver intentionally making their child sick in order for the caregiver to, again, receive that attention. So it's not even about the child at all. The child is a catalyst to then receive attention, but I'm not damaging my body. I'm now damaging my child's body.
Would that also play if you were taking care of like a sibling or a parent or something? Would it still be by Munchausen by proxy? Or is it only the child?
Yes. I mean, it has to be like there has to be a huge power differential. So it can't be like, I'm doing it to my brother who's, 6 foot, whatever. And it's too.
But if he's incapacitated, let's say.
If there's
your caregiver,
yes.
that's what okay.
Yes. So there's like an adult child, but they have cognitive impairments that now they're a child, even though they're in an adult body. Yes, because there's that huge power differential.
Okay. All right. I think I understand a little better. Well, Jason, do you have any questions for us? You've been pretty silent.
Allow me to turn my microphone on before I start in on that. The one thing that stands out to me about this conversation this week was the desensitization of the brain in relation to, in this particular case, dealing with sexual activity and how that makes the different things in your brain fire and this, that, and the other thing. You mentioned that porn addiction and things of this nature. I'm going to ruffle so many feathers right now. Porn addiction is not something that's talked about generally because of the embarrassment that is attached to it, for whether you agree with it or not. It is a situation that does need to be addressed in a very professional and sensitive manner.
Mm-hmm.
I have been aware of this, not because of me personally, let me just say, but this is very prominent in the wrestling business because they get so wrapped up in the ego of their character and their gimmick, right, and they bring that to real life in that kind of situation. They have now blurred the lines between what's reality and what is show business or fantasy or gimmick or what have you.
Right.
This is one of the underlying, the ugly parts of the wrestling business that people don't talk about. But you see it, like, as soon as you guys started in on this, I'm like, holy shit, this is where this gets incorporated. And this, as a promoter, I had people who worked for me to come to me privately. I have a problem, and it was this.
Right.
And it's not just on an independent level. Some of the biggest names in the history of this industry dealt with this, and some of them have gone on public record, whether it be film or podcast or whatever, and have discussed it. Jake the Snake Roberts is a prime example of this. Yeah. But his was also fed into the addiction with drugs and with alcohol. Like it's a wonder that man's still alive, mm-hmm, based on what he had put himself through. So it's not just one demographic of people that it is usually associated with unfairly, I might add. this this affects people from all walks of life, people that you root for, people that you've never met and never will. It is not exclusive to any kind of
Nope.
a demo, a sex, a creed, a religion. It does not matter.
No.
And if you are dealing with something like this, the only way you're going to get on the other side of this is to seek professional help. And again, and this is a reoccurring theme, there's no shame in that. You know, do your research, make sure you're getting with somebody who's reputable, who has, that is going to be able to help you. This is not something that you're going to want to talk openly to the bartender at your neighborhood tavern. You know?
Right.
May be a great guy, may be wise beyond his years, but you put yourself in that kind of situation, it will not be long before everybody in town knows what the fuck is going on.
Right.
And that's generally not what you wanted, you know. This could actually be its own topic, you know, in terms of my expertise with this or my exposure to this. But I will say, like, this is actually a very timely topic, and like I have done with multiple episodes of your guys' show, I have taken the link. I'm like, listen to this. You are dealing with this, or you are dealing with a variation of this. I think this might be able to help you out a little bit. So, yeah, this could really, I would have a much more, not invested, because I was invested in this, but I would bring more to the table if we focused exclusively within this genre, because that's where my knowledge comes from.
Sure.
But you know, also along those lines, I also learned a lot again, you know, as I do each and every week that you guys sit here, and I find myself, like I do every week, yep, I get that resonates. If I was dealing with something like this is exactly how I would do it, and exactly what needs to be done. And then there's other sites like, oh wow, I didn't know that. It just didn't click. So it's cool to get a personal perspective on it, and then you turn around and you get the professional, side to it, and it's very important. And this is what people need to hear for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So with that, we've got a couple new lines that are coming out for the online store. One is the back to school line. Some legacy lines are coming out. Your show got a new piece of merch that dropped yesterday, as a matter of fact, as we're recording this. The You Are Not Alone sweatshirt and t-shirt are now available on the online store. pfcstore.printify.me for all the latest merchandise for all of the great shows here. And if you have any questions, okay, let me address this real quick. Facebook is becoming a real bitch in terms of your guys' show account page. And
I don't know what's happening.
So I don't either. Like, the fact that I got to get tagged in on this, like, heads are going to fucking roll is what's happening. I need to figure out whose head I'm going to target here. So let me say this to your listeners. If you are having problems corresponding or sending a DM or what have you to the girls on the show, it is not on them. Facebook, for whatever reason, has targeted their page, and we're trying to get it figured out. So just be patient. Is there an alternate email that they could send correspondence to you that you guys would feel comfortable with to put out there? If they can't get a hold of you, if they have questions or anything like that, they can't contact you through the Facebook page. Is there another realm of communication?
There is. It's the WDTAT at Gmail. And I think it's SSHHHH. No, I think it's it's SSWD because it's two S's at the beginning. SS and then the WDTAT, whatever it is. But yeah. How do we spell that, Jason? Because I don't know.
WDTAT. All right, but it is on your page, yes?
Yeah, it's on there. The email should be on there. I'll go look today and make sure that it, as long as I have access, but I had access earlier today. So I'll go look and make sure, but I'm pretty sure I put it on there. If not, they have the PFC. I know the PFC one is, I did put there is an email on there. I just don't know which one it is. And I can't look at it while I'm on the Skype.
Right.
We're super professional over here, you guys.
Well,
like everything is so under control. I'm talking about me, not you.
Don't worry, I got it. It's SHWDTAT@gmail.com.
There you go. That's what it is. That's Natalie for the win. That's why we have a professional online.
We will put a link in that in the description of the show. So in case Facebook is being asshole-ish on that particular day, like I said, this has come across my radar because I do not get involved with the individual show accounts that I am not a host on.
I know. I'm sorry.
Well, it's not your fault. It's Zuckerberg's fault. And if his head's the one that's got to roll, I'm here for it. I'm here to tell you, though, now that this has come across my radar and has been elevated to annoyance level, shit's is gonna get handled. I just got to figure out who I'm going after, because there's so much other bullshit on that stupid platform that should be targeted and flagged and pulled down. This ain't one of them.
Right.
Let's get our shit together and actually, instead of putting bots in place, let's get some goddamn humans to actually see what's going on. Because I'm convinced that's what's happening. It's a bot that has whatever word has been reoccurring that flagged it. It's one word.
And they don't tell you what it is.
Right.
They just say you violated our community standards. Which one? Like, I went through and read them and I'm like, I don't understand what I violated. I don't get it. The only thing I can think of is that they're saying that we represent a business because it's a podcast or something. And instead of it being like, but other pages represent businesses.
Right.
So
they're violating my guidelines, and I take that personally. So be that as it may.
All right. Well, we appreciate you, Jason.
With that, be patient with us. We're going to get it figured out. Stay tuned to all of our socials for all the latest news and information on this show and all the great shows under the PFC Entertainment Network. And until next time, go out, be awesome to yourselves and to each other, and we will see you in 2 weeks with the next installment of Shh, We Don't Talk About That here on the PFC Entertainment Network.